The air smells like jet fuel and salt water. It's early morning at Idlewild, 1963, and the light comes in low and gray through terminal windows that haven't been cleaned in weeks. A woman in a mink coat stands motionless near Gate 12, staring at a departures board that hasn't updated in 40 minutes. Her lipstick is perfect. Her hands are shaking. Nearby, a man in a fedora watches the tarmac through scratched glass, counting the number of planes that never seem to leave. The carpet beneath them is worn thin in paths that lead nowhere specific. All around them, the building hums with a sound that might be ventilation or might be something else entirely. Someone believed this place would change what it meant to arrive in America. The question was whether arrival could ever feel like belonging. The field that refused to stay empty. There was a time when the land was mostly water and marsh grass, a stretch of Queens that developers avoided because the ground wouldn't hold weight. Idlewild was named after a golf course that had gone under during the Depression, and before that, it was farmland no one particularly wanted. The city acquired it in 1942, during wartime, when the idea of a massive civilian airport seemed both visionary and slightly deranged. LaGuardia was already overcrowded. Newark belonged to another state. New York needed something bigger, something that could absorb the coming wave of post-war aviation, though no one was entirely sure what that wave would look like or whether it would ever arrive. The early plans were drawn up in rooms where men smoked and argued about runway orientations and wind patterns. Some believed the site was too far from Manhattan, too isolated, too vulnerable to weather coming off Jamaica Bay. Others saw emptiness as opportunity. The marsh could be filled. The distance could be bridged. What mattered was scale. The ability to imagine something that didn't yet exist and convince enough people that it should. Construction began while the war was still going, though progress was slow and periodically halted by material shortages and shifting priorities. Workers poured millions of cubic yards of sand and fill into wetlands, creating land where there had been none, raising the ground high enough to support concrete and steel and the weight of machines that were still being designed. By 1948, the airport opened for limited commercial service, though it barely resembled the vision that had been sold to the public. The terminals were temporary. The roads were unfinished. Passengers arrived by bus or taxi, along routes that flooded when it rained. But planes were landing, and that was enough to justify the next phase, and the phase after that. The name Idlewild stuck for years, a strange rural echo attached to a place that was supposed to represent the future. It sounded like somewhere time had stopped, rather than somewhere it was accelerating. Some liked that. Others found it embarrassing, a reminder that New York's gateway to the world was still named after a golf course that had failed. The logic of the place was always a little off. The airport was designed not as a single unified structure, but as a constellation of separate terminals, each operated by a different airline, each reflecting a different vision of what modern travel should feel like. There was no central processing, no shared aesthetic. Passengers moved between terminals by bus or on foot, exposed to weather, dragging luggage across access roads that weren't meant for pedestrians. It created a fragmented experience, a sense that the airport was less a place than a collection of competing places, each trying to outdo the others in grandeur or efficiency, or something harder to define. But fragmentation also created possibility. Each airline could build whatever it wanted. Pan Am could commission Eero Saarinen. TWA could create a terminal that looked like a bird in flight. Eastern could go brutalist. American could stay conservative. The lack of coordination became a kind of accidental freedom, a space where architectural experimentation was not just allowed, but expected. Idlewild became a gallery of mid-century ambition, each terminal a statement about what the future was supposed to look like, though none of them agreed on the details. Some believed this was genius, others thought it was chaos. The truth, as usual, was somewhere in the gap between intention and result, in the space where vision meets the limitations of funding and politics and weather and time. The terminal that looked like a dream. When the TWA Flight Center opened in 1962, people didn't know what to call it. It wasn't just a building, it was a sculpture you could walk through, a piece of architecture that seemed to have been poured rather than constructed, all curves and white concrete and soaring interior spaces that defied the rectangular logic of most airports. Eero Saarinen had died before it was completed, but the design was entirely his, a shape that suggested movement even when standing still. The roof swept upward like wings, the windows wrapped around corners. The interior felt weightless, as if gravity had been negotiated downward. It was meant to evoke the experience of flight before you ever boarded a plane. Walking through the terminal was supposed to feel like lifting off, like being inside the machine rather than waiting to enter it. Every surface curved, every angle was soft. There were no right angles anywhere in the main hall, nothing that reminded you of the ground or of buildings that stayed in one place. Saarinen wanted passengers to feel like they were already traveling, already suspended between departure and arrival, already part of the sky. But beauty created problems. The curved walls made it difficult to install standard equipment. The soaring ceilings made heating and cooling inefficient. The flowing interior spaces left little room for the back-of-house functions that airports actually need, the baggage systems and staff areas and mechanical rooms that keep things running. Form had been prioritized so completely over function that the building struggled to operate as an actual airport terminal. It was stunning. It was also impractical. Some loved it for that. Others saw it as evidence that architects cared more about magazines than passengers. The terminal became famous almost immediately, appearing in films and advertisements and architecture journals, a symbol of what American design could achieve when it wasn't constrained by caution or tradition. People came to see it who had no intention of flying. It was a tourist attraction, a landmark, proof that airports didn't have to be purely utilitarian. But it was also a fantasy, a vision of travel that existed more fully in photographs than in the experience of people actually trying to catch a flight. The gap between how it looked and how it worked was never fully closed. Years later, when TWA collapsed and the terminal was abandoned, people argued about what to do with it. Some wanted to tear it down, others wanted to preserve it. The question was whether architecture this beautiful had value independent of its function, whether a building designed for a specific purpose could survive when that purpose disappeared. The terminal sat empty for years, its curves gathering dust, its windows overlooking runways it no longer served. It may have been the most photographed abandoned space in New York, a ruin that still looked like the future even as it decayed. Another explanation suggests that Saarinen understood something most airport designers didn't, that terminals are not just processing centers but psychological thresholds, places where people confront the strangeness of leaving and arriving, of being neither here nor there. Maybe the impracticality was the point. Maybe a terminal that made you feel something was worth more than a terminal that simply moved you efficiently from curb to gate. Or maybe it was just a beautiful building that didn't work very well. The verdict, like so much else, remains open. What the name was supposed to fix. In December 1963, 1 month after the assassination, the airport was renamed. Idlewild became John F. Kennedy International Airport, a decision made quickly, with little public debate, by officials who believed the gesture was both appropriate and necessary. The name change was supposed to honor a fallen president. It was also supposed to modernize the airport's image, replacing a rural-sounding relic with something that sounded global and significant. Whether it actually accomplished either goal depended on who you asked and when you asked them. Some saw the renaming as a memorial, a way of attaching Kennedy's vision of progress and internationalism to a place that was supposed to represent America's connection to the world. He had been president during the height of the space race, during the expansion of commercial jet travel, during a moment when the future seemed both thrilling and precarious. Naming the airport after him linked those ideas to the physical experience of arrival and departure, turning every flight into a small reminder of what had been lost and what was still possible. Others found it uncomfortable, the speed of the decision, the way tragedy was converted almost immediately into branding. The assassination was still raw. The funeral had been less than a month earlier. Renaming the airport felt to some like an attempt to move on before grief had been fully processed, to replace mourning with symbolism. There was also the awkward fact that Kennedy had little personal connection to the airport. He had used it, of course, but so had every president. The name wasn't tied to anything he had done there, or any policy he had championed, specifically about aviation. The practical effect of the renaming was almost immediate. Maps were reprinted, signs were changed, airlines updated their materials. But among New Yorkers, especially cab drivers and longtime residents, the old name lingered. People still said Idlewild for years, sometimes out of habit, sometimes out of resistance to a change they hadn't asked for. The new name took time to settle in, to feel natural, to stop sounding like something imposed from above. What the name was supposed to accomplish beyond the symbolic was never entirely clear. It didn't change how the airport functioned. It didn't solve the congestion, or improve the access roads, or unify the scattered terminals. It gave the place a different identity, but identity without infrastructure is just marketing. Some believed that was enough, that airports exist as much in the imagination as in physical space, that what you call a place shapes how people experience it. Others thought it was a distraction, a way of avoiding harder questions about whether the airport was actually serving the city or just accumulating prestige. The name stuck, though, and over time it became impossible to imagine the airport being called anything else. JFK became shorthand, not just for the airport, but for a certain kind of arrival, a specific vision of what it meant to land in America. Whether that vision matched reality was a separate question, one that each arriving passenger had to answer for themselves. The Pan Am Worldport and the promise of Everywhere Pan Am believed it was building more than a terminal. The Worldport, which opened in 1960, was designed to handle the Boeing 747, an aircraft that didn't yet exist, but that Pan Am was certain would change everything. The terminal was circular, a massive umbrella structure with gates radiating outward like spokes, allowing planes to dock directly at the building rather than requiring passengers to cross the tarmac. It was modern. It was efficient. It was also a bet on a future that wasn't guaranteed. The design assumed that air travel would keep growing, that planes would keep getting bigger, that the world would keep shrinking in ways that benefited airlines like Pan Am. For a while, that assumption held. The 747 did arrive in 1970, and it was everything Pan Am had hoped for. A wide-body jet that could carry hundreds of passengers across oceans, making international travel accessible in ways it had never been before. The Worldport became the hub for those flights, the place where America connected to everywhere else, where arriving passengers got their first glimpse of the country and departing passengers took their last look back. But the terminal also revealed something about the limitations of certainty. Pan Am built the Worldport as if its dominance was permanent, as if the company would always be the flagship carrier, always be the airline people thought of when they thought about international travel. The circular design looked futuristic in 1960. By 1980, it looked dated. By 1991, when Pan Am collapsed, it looked like a relic. The problem wasn't the architecture. The problem was that the architecture had been designed for a version of the future that didn't arrive. The Worldport was demolished in 2013, imploded in a controlled explosion that took less than a minute. Videos of the collapse circulated online, watched by people who remembered flying through it, who remembered the excitement of boarding a 747, who remembered when Pan Am felt like the only airline that mattered. The demolition was practical. The terminal was outdated, inefficient, unable to handle modern security requirements or the operational needs of contemporary airlines. But it also felt symbolic, the erasure of a specific vision of what global travel was supposed to be. Some mourned its loss. Others saw it as overdue. What almost everyone agreed on was that the Worldport represented a moment when airlines believed they could shape the future rather than just respond to it, when architecture was a statement of ambition rather than a reaction to constraint. Whether that ambition was visionary or delusional depended on whether you remembered the terminal in its prime or only saw it in its decline. Another explanation suggests that the Worldport's failure wasn't about design, but about economics, about the fact that Pan Am overextended, misread the market, failed to adapt to deregulation, and increased competition. The terminal worked fine. The business model didn't. But that explanation doesn't account for why the building felt so tied to the company's identity, why its demolition felt like the end of something larger than just a structure. Maybe buildings absorb the hopes of the people who create them, and when those hopes collapse, the buildings become unbearable reminders. Or maybe a terminal is just a terminal, and nostalgia makes it mean more than it ever did. The arrivals hall and the faces that changed. There's a particular quality to the light in an arrivals hall, especially in the early years before renovations softened the institutional edges. Fluorescent tubes overhead, scuffed tile floors, rows of faces waiting behind barriers, scanning every passenger who emerged from customs, holding signs, holding flowers, holding nothing but expectation. JFK's arrivals hall was where the idea of America as destination became visible, where the abstraction of immigration turned into eye contact and recognition and relief. In the 1960s and 70s, the demographics of arrival shifted. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 ended the quota system that had favored European immigrants, opening the door to waves of arrivals from Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, and Africa. JFK became the portal for that transformation. Families arrived from Korea, from India, from the Dominican Republic, from Ghana. They came with suitcases held together by rope. They came with addresses written on scraps of paper. They came with the particular exhaustion of long flights and longer waits, and the uncertainty of what came next. The airport was never designed with those arrivals in mind. The terminals had been built assuming a certain type of passenger, business travelers and tourists, people with return tickets and hotel reservations. The infrastructure struggled to accommodate families with children, elderly relatives, passengers who didn't speak English, people for whom this flight was not the beginning of a vacation, but the beginning of a life. Processing took hours. Lines snaked through hallways. Translators were scarce. The building's mid-century optimism met the messy reality of people who didn't fit neatly into the imagined categories. But something else happened too. Something harder to quantify. The arrivals hall became a kind of threshold space, a place where identity was both challenged and confirmed, where arriving passengers had to present themselves to officials and then to family, and then to a country that had specific ideas about who belonged and how. Some passed through quickly. Others were detained, questioned, sent to secondary inspection for reasons that were never fully explained. The architecture of arrival included rooms most passengers never saw, holding areas and interview rooms and spaces designed for refusal as much as welcome. The faces waiting in the arrivals hall changed too. By the 1980s, it was common to see multi-generational clusters, children holding signs for grandparents they'd never met, siblings reuniting after years of separation, caused by visa backlogs and bureaucratic delays. The emotional intensity of those reunions was real, but so was the strangeness of meeting family in a place that felt nothing like home, under fluorescent lights, with announcements echoing overhead, in languages no one in the family spoke. Some believed JFK represented the best of American openness, the willingness to absorb new arrivals, to let the country be reshaped by people coming from elsewhere. Others saw the airport as a filtering mechanism, a place where certain people were welcomed and others were made to wait, where the promise of arrival was always conditional. Both views were true, simultaneously, in ways that made the arrivals hall a more complicated space than its architecture suggested. Another explanation focuses less on policy and more on the simple fact of distance, the way airports make visible the gap between where someone is from and where they've arrived. For passengers coming from countries where family and community are tightly woven, the American emphasis on individualism and self-reliance can feel shocking even before leaving the terminal. The arrivals hall was the first place that shock registered, the first place people realized that arrival didn't mean they had arrived, that the journey was just beginning. Or maybe that's reading too much into a room with bad lighting and worn floors. Maybe it was just a place where people waited. The numbers that made it real. By 1975, JFK was handling over 21 million passengers a year, more than any other international gateway in the United States. The airport covered 4,880 acres, roughly the size of Manhattan below 59th Street. It had 4 parallel runways, each between 8,000 and 14,000 feet long, capable of handling the heaviest aircraft in commercial service. On a typical day, more than 800 flights arrived or departed, connecting New York to 90 cities in over 50 countries. The terminals employed 17,000 people directly, with tens of thousands more working in related industries: cargo handling, ground transportation, food service, retail, maintenance, security. Cargo operations processed over 1.6 million tons of freight annually. Everything from machinery to medicine to flowers flown in overnight from South America. The fuel farm stored 42 million gallons of jet fuel, distributed through a network of underground pipes that stretched across the entire airport. The central heating and cooling plant generated enough energy to power a small city, over 120 million BTUs per hour during peak demand. Baggage systems moved approximately 65,000 checked bags per day, though the rate of lost luggage remained stubbornly high, hovering around 2%, which meant over 1,300 bags went missing every single day. The Port Authority, which managed the airport, had invested over $2 billion in infrastructure by the mid-70s, a figure that seemed enormous at the time and inadequate in retrospect. Roads leading to the airport were perpetually congested. Parking structures were full by mid-morning. The air train didn't exist yet. Public transit connections were minimal. Most passengers arrived by taxi or car service, contributing to traffic that stretched for miles during peak hours. The airport's economic impact on the region was estimated at over $8 billion annually, supporting more than 200,000 jobs across the metropolitan area. These numbers were supposed to prove success, to demonstrate that the airport was fulfilling its mission as a global gateway. But numbers can also reveal strain. 21 million passengers meant overcrowded terminals. 800 daily flights meant delays rippling through the system. 17,000 employees meant labor disputes and strikes, and the constant tension between management and unions. 42 million gallons of fuel meant vulnerability to price shocks and supply disruptions. Every number that demonstrated scale also hinted at fragility, the sense that the entire operation was running at the edge of its capacity, that any disruption could cascade into something larger. Some looked at those numbers and saw achievement. Others saw warning signs. The airport was growing faster than its infrastructure could support, absorbing more passengers, more flights, more cargo, more pressure, without corresponding investments in the systems needed to handle that growth. The question wasn't whether the airport was impressive. The question was whether it was sustainable, whether the ambition that had created it could be maintained, or whether it would eventually collapse under its own weight. The strikes that stopped everything. Labor was always the hidden foundation. Beneath the soaring terminals and the architectural ambition were the workers who actually made the airport function. Baggage handlers, mechanics, cleaners, security guards, food service employees, maintenance crews, ground staff, gate agents, ticket counters, cargo loaders, fuel truck drivers, and dozens of other roles that passengers never saw but couldn't travel without. And when those workers stopped, the entire system froze. The strikes came in waves. 1966 saw a mechanics walkout that grounded flights for weeks. 1975 brought a work stoppage by air traffic controllers that snarled operations across the region. 1980 saw multiple labor actions by ground crews, each one revealing how dependent the airport was on people who were underpaid, overworked, and increasingly unwilling to accept conditions that enriched airlines while leaving them behind. The strikes were about wages and benefits and working conditions, but they were also about visibility, about forcing passengers to recognize that air travel depended on labor, not just technology. Each strike followed a similar pattern. Negotiations would stall, workers would walk out, flights would be canceled, passengers would be stranded. The media would cover the disruption, interviewing angry travelers who just wanted to get where they were going. Airlines would condemn the unions as selfish. Unions would point to record airline profits and executive compensation. Eventually, a deal would be reached, temporary and fragile, holding until the next contract expired and the cycle began again. But the strikes also exposed deeper fractures. Many of the airport's workers were immigrants, people who had arrived through JFK as passengers and ended up staying as employees, taking jobs that paid poorly but offered a foothold in the city. They worked long shifts in basement-level cargo areas or on the tarmac in all weather, jobs that were physically demanding and often dangerous. Injury rates were high. Job security was low. The gap between the airport's image as a symbol of progress and the reality of working conditions was a source of constant tension. Some believed the strikes were necessary, the only leverage workers had against airlines and the Port Authority, both of which prioritized efficiency and profit over the people who made the system run. Others saw the strikes as selfish, as hurting passengers who had no involvement in labor disputes, as weaponizing an essential service. Both perspectives had merit. Both missed the larger point, which was that the airport's dependence on low-wage labor was structural, built into the economics of aviation in ways that made conflict inevitable. Another explanation suggests that the strikes were less about JFK specifically, and more about the broader collapse of the post-war labor consensus. The moment when unions lost the power to negotiate effectively, when deregulation shifted the balance decisively toward management, when the vision of shared prosperity gave way to a model where workers absorbed risk while shareholders captured rewards. The airport was just where that shift became visible, where the promise of upward mobility collided with the reality of stagnant wages and disappearing benefits. Or maybe that's imposing too much theory on what were simply disputes about money and dignity. Maybe people just wanted to be paid fairly for hard work. Maybe that was enough. The architecture of security. After everything changed. Before 1970, passengers could walk directly to the gate without showing identification or passing through any screening. Families could wait with departing passengers right up until boarding. Airports were porous, open, designed with the assumption that the primary threat was delay rather than danger. That assumption ended with a series of hijackings in the late 60s and early 70s, incidents that forced a rethinking of what airports were and who they needed to protect against. Metal detectors appeared first, awkward devices that passengers walked through while security guards watched, unsure what to do when the alarm sounded. X-ray machines followed, for carry-on bags, then for checked luggage. Gates moved behind security checkpoints. Non-passengers were banned from gate areas. The changes were incremental at first, each new measure responding to a specific threat, a specific failure, a specific nightmare scenario that had become real. But cumulatively, they transformed the experience of air travel, adding layers of friction between arrival at the airport and actual departure. JFK implemented these changes unevenly. Some airlines adopted stricter screening faster than others. Some terminals installed better equipment. Some checkpoints were staffed by trained security personnel. Others relied on minimum wage workers with minimal training. The inconsistency created confusion and frustration, passengers unclear about what was required, security staff unclear about what they were screening for. The goal was safety, but the execution revealed how difficult it was to retrofit security onto buildings that had never been designed with it in mind. The bigger shift came after 1973, after an even more devastating wave of attacks, after Lockerbie in 1988, after every incident that forced airlines and governments to confront the fact that aircraft were vulnerable in ways that were difficult to defend against. Security became theater, a performance of vigilance meant to reassure passengers that everything was under control, even when the measures taken were often reactive and incomplete. Bags were searched, passengers were questioned, profiles were developed. Some people were pulled aside for additional screening based on criteria that were never made public and often seemed arbitrary. The architecture of terminals began to change too, designed now with security as a primary consideration. Checkpoints created bottlenecks. Secure areas required barriers. Surveillance cameras appeared everywhere. The open, flowing spaces of mid-century design gave way to layouts that prioritized control and monitoring, that assumed passengers were potential threats until proven otherwise. The shift was subtle but profound, a move from terminals designed to inspire to terminals designed to contain. Some believed this was necessary. the inevitable cost of making air travel safe in a world where people were willing to use planes as weapons. Others saw it as a loss, the erosion of the openness and ease that had made air travel appealing in the first place, the replacement of trust with suspicion. Both views acknowledged the same basic fact, that airports after the early 70s were fundamentally different places, that something had been given up in the name of security, and that no one was entirely sure whether the trade-off had been worth it. Another explanation focuses less on security measures themselves, and more on how they reshaped the psychology of travel. Passing through a checkpoint, removing shoes, unpacking laptops, submitting to scrutiny, all of it creates a mindset of compliance, a sense that travel is something you're allowed to do rather than something you have a right to do. The architecture enforces that mindset. Long lines, narrow corridors, harsh lighting, announcements warning against jokes or unattended bags. Every element of the design communicates that you are being watched, that deviation will be noticed, that the freedom to travel comes with conditions. Whether that's security or something else depends on how you feel about being watched. The terminals that aged too fast. By the 1980s, many of JFK's terminals were showing their age in ways that couldn't be hidden by fresh paint or new carpet. The problem wasn't just maintenance. The problem was that the buildings had been designed for a different era, for smaller planes and fewer passengers and technologies that no longer existed. Jetways that couldn't accommodate wide-body aircraft, baggage systems that broke down constantly, electrical systems inadequate for modern computers. Terminals built in the 50s and 60s were functionally obsolete 30 years later, relics of optimism that hadn't accounted for how quickly the future would become the past. Some airlines tried to renovate. They'd upgrade gate areas, install new seating, modernize ticketing counters. But the underlying structure remained, the bones of buildings that couldn't be easily adapted. Pan Am's Worldport started to feel cramped. TWA's Flight Center, so stunning when it opened, proved almost impossible to modify without destroying what made it distinctive. Eastern's terminal looked increasingly brutal in the worst sense, its concrete weathered and stained, its interior dark and uninviting. Each terminal reflected the ambitions of the airline that built it, and as those airlines declined, the terminals declined with them. The fragmentation that had once seemed innovative now felt chaotic. Passengers connecting between terminals had to exit security, take a bus, re-enter security at another terminal. There was no unified wayfinding system, no consistent design language. Each terminal operated independently, with different shops, different services, different levels of upkeep. Flying through JFK often meant experiencing 3 or 4 different versions of the airport in a single journey, none of them particularly good. Efforts to unify the terminals came and went, grand plans announced, and then quietly shelved when funding disappeared or priorities shifted. The Port Authority proposed connector buildings, centralized check-in, automated people movers, all ideas that made sense on paper, but required coordination and investment that never fully materialized. Meanwhile, the terminals kept aging, kept accumulating the wear of millions of passengers, kept feeling more dated each year as newer airports in other cities opened with integrated designs and modern amenities. Some saw the aging terminals as evidence of decline, proof that New York was losing its status as America's primary gateway, that other cities with newer airports were becoming more attractive connection points. Others saw it as a maintenance issue, solvable with enough money and political will. The truth was probably somewhere in between, in the gap between what cities want their airports to be and what they're willing to pay to maintain them. Another explanation suggests that airports age differently than other buildings because they're judged not just on appearance, but on efficiency, on how quickly they can move people from curb to gate and back again. An old airport that works well can feel better than a new airport that doesn't. But JFK's terminals were both old and inefficient, compounding problems that might have been forgiven individually, but became unbearable in combination. By the 90s, the airport's reputation had shifted from world-class to embarrassment, a place people flew through because they had to, not because they wanted to. Whether that reputation was fair or exaggerated depended on which terminal you used and which airline you flew. The cargo that no one sees. Below and behind the passenger terminals, a parallel airport operated, one focused entirely on the movement of goods. JFK's cargo operations were massive, handling everything from electronics to pharmaceuticals to perishable foods, goods that needed to arrive quickly and couldn't tolerate delay. The cargo area sprawled across hundreds of acres, a landscape of warehouses and loading docks and security fences, lit by sodium vapor lights that turned everything the color of rust. The volume was staggering. In the mid-80s, JFK processed over 1.8 million tons of air cargo annually, making it one of the busiest cargo hubs in the world. Planes arrived at night, unloaded, reloaded, departed before dawn. Forklifts moved pallets. Conveyor belts sorted packages. Workers in climate-controlled warehouses handled goods that required specific temperatures, specific handling procedures, specific documentation. The operation ran 24 hours a day, every day, Christmas included, because global supply chains don't observe holidays. But cargo operations also attracted attention for reasons that had nothing to do with efficiency. The scale of the operation, the speed, the lack of oversight created opportunities for theft and smuggling that were difficult to control. The Lufthansa heist in 1978, when thieves stole over $5 million in cash and jewelry from a cargo building, exposed how vulnerable the area was, how easy it was for organized crime to infiltrate airport operations, how little the Port Authority seemed to know about what was happening on its own property. The heist became famous, mythologized in films and books, but it was just the most visible example of a larger problem. Cargo theft was routine. Goods disappeared from warehouses. Shipments arrived missing items. Investigations went nowhere. The cargo area existed in a strange legal and jurisdictional gray zone, managed by the Port Authority, but populated by dozens of independent contractors and freight forwarders, each with their own security, protocols, or lack thereof. Who was responsible when something went wrong was never entirely clear. Some believed the problem was structural, that the sheer volume of cargo moving through JFK made comprehensive security impossible, that the airport prioritized speed over scrutiny, that theft was accepted as a cost of doing business. Others pointed to corruption, to workers and supervisors who looked the other way, to organized crime's long history of involvement in air cargo operations, to the difficulty of policing a workforce that was transient and poorly paid. Both explanations had evidence to support them. Neither offered a clear solution. Another explanation suggests that cargo operations revealed the airport's real purpose, that passengers were almost secondary to the movement of goods, that JFK's economic value came not from tourism or business travel, but from its role in global trade networks. If that's true, then the theft and smuggling were inevitable, side effects of a system designed to move things quickly without asking too many questions. Or maybe that's too cynical. Maybe most of the cargo moved legitimately. Maybe the crimes were exceptions. Maybe the question is why we remember the exceptions more vividly than the routine. The delays that never get explained. Weather delays, air traffic delays, mechanical delays, crew delays, gate delays, ground delays. The language of delay became its own vocabulary at JFK, terms passengers learned to decode, trying to figure out whether they'd be leaving in an hour or not at all. The delays were constant, woven into the experience of flying through the airport, accepted by frequent travelers as inevitable and resented by everyone else as evidence that something fundamental wasn't working. Some of the delays were explicable. Weather on the East Coast is unpredictable. Storms rolling in off the Atlantic with little warning, fog settling over the runways, snow accumulating faster than plows could clear it. 4 parallel runways sound like a lot until you realize that certain wind conditions make some unusable, that traffic control can only handle so many simultaneous operations, that the airspace over New York is some of the most congested in the world. Delays cascaded. A morning backup pushed flights into afternoon slots. Afternoon delays stretched into evening. By night, the entire schedule was in chaos. Crews timing out, gates unavailable, passengers rebooked onto flights that were themselves delayed. But other delays were harder to explain. Planes would sit at the gate for an hour with no announcement. Boarding would begin and then stop. Passengers would be loaded, then deplaned, then loaded again. The reasons given were vague. We're waiting for paperwork. There's a slight mechanical issue. We're awaiting final weight and balance calculations. The lack of transparency bred frustration and conspiracy theories. Passengers convinced the airline was lying, that delays were being caused by overbooking or cost-cutting or sheer incompetence. The delays revealed how fragile the system was, how dependent on everything working correctly. A single delayed flight could throw off an entire day's schedule. A gate held up by a late arrival meant another plane couldn't dock. A crew delayed in another city meant a plane without anyone to fly it. The system was tightly coordinated in theory, but constantly breaking in practice, each breakdown creating problems that took hours to untangle. Passengers absorbed the consequences, stranded in terminals that were never designed for long waits, eating overpriced food, sitting in uncomfortable chairs, watching departure boards that promised updates that never came. Some blamed the airlines. Others blamed air traffic control. Others blamed the Port Authority for not building more runways or managing gate assignments better. The blame shifted depending on who you asked, but the delays remained constant, a feature of flying through JFK that everyone accepted even as they resented it. The airport had a reputation for being difficult, for making travel harder than it needed to be, for turning what should have been routine into something exhausting. Another explanation suggests that delays weren't a failure, but a design feature, that the airport was deliberately kept operating at capacity because empty gates and unused runway slots represented lost revenue, that efficiency was sacrificed for utilization, that passengers were expected to tolerate delays because the alternative was flights that didn't exist at all. If that's true, then the delays were the cost of access, the trade-off for having so many destinations available from one airport. Or maybe that's just rationalization. Maybe the delays were exactly what they felt like, evidence that the airport couldn't handle the volume it was trying to process, that growth had outpaced infrastructure, that no one wanted to admit the system was broken. The faces in the photographs. There's a collection of photographs from JFK's early years, black and white images taken by photographers for airlines and magazines, promotional material meant to sell the glamour of jet travel. In these photographs, passengers are always well-dressed, always smiling, always white. The men wear suits, the women wear gloves and hats. Everyone looks prosperous and confident, as if flying is the most natural thing in the world. The terminals in the background are clean and bright. The planes are gleaming. The whole scene radiates optimism. But these photographs were staged, carefully composed to present a specific vision of who flew and why. They erased everyone else. The immigrants arriving from countries the quota system had just opened up to. The working-class families saving for years to afford a single trip. The service workers and cleaners who kept the terminals running. The cargo handlers and maintenance crews who worked through the night. All of them were at the airport, but none of them appeared in the promotional photographs, as if their presence would contradict the story airlines wanted to tell. Over time, the photographs changed. By the 70s and 80s, the images became more diverse, reflecting the reality of who was actually flying. But even then, the photographs maintained a certain sanitized quality, avoiding anything that might suggest difficulty or discomfort, or the less picturesque aspects of air travel. You didn't see people sleeping on terminal floors during delays. You didn't see families arguing with gate agents about canceled flights. You didn't see the exhaustion of red-eye arrivals, or the anxiety of deportation proceedings happening in rooms behind closed doors. The gap between the photographs and the reality was the gap between vision and experience, between what the airport was supposed to represent and what it actually felt like to move through it. Some people's experiences matched the photographs, smooth and pleasant and affirming. Others found the airport alienating, a place designed for people who weren't them, where they were tolerated but not welcomed, where every interaction carried the possibility of being questioned or delayed or turned away. Some believed the photographs were aspirational, showing what the airport could be at its best, what people should expect and demand. Others saw them as propaganda, selling a version of air travel that was only available to a privileged few, while the majority endured conditions that would never appear in a magazine spread. Both interpretations acknowledged that images shape perception, that how a place is photographed influences how it's understood, that the archive of JFK's history is incomplete, missing more than it contains. Another explanation suggests that all institutional photography works this way, that airports and hotels and universities always present idealized versions of themselves, that no one expects promotional materials to show reality in all its complexity and contradiction. But that doesn't make the gap less significant. It just means we're trained to expect it, to read between the images, to know that what we'll encounter will be different from what we've been shown. The question is whether that gap erodes trust, or whether we've simply learned to live with it, to accept that representation and reality are two different things, that the airport in the photographs and the airport you experience are parallel versions that never quite align. The connections that changed everything again. By the late 90s, JFK faced a crisis of relevance. Other airports had modernized. Atlanta had become the world's busiest. Chicago O'Hare had expanded. Even Newark across the river had invested in new terminals and better connections to Manhattan. JFK remained stuck, its terminals aging, its access roads congested, its reputation declining. Passengers avoided it when they could, connecting through other cities, choosing airports that felt less dysfunctional. The Port Authority knew something had to change, but the question was what and how much, and whether any intervention could restore what the airport had lost. The answer came in the form of infrastructure, not glamour. The air train, which opened in 2003, finally connected the airport to the subway system, making it possible to reach Manhattan without a taxi or car service. The connection was indirect, requiring a transfer at Jamaica Station, and the fare structure was complicated, but it worked. For the first time, the airport was part of the city's public transit network, accessible to people who couldn't afford a $40 cab ride, integrated into the rhythms of how New Yorkers actually moved around. The air train changed who could use the airport and how. Students and young travelers started flying through JFK more frequently. Workers who lived in Queens could reach their airport jobs without owning a car. The connection didn't solve the airport's deeper problems, the aging terminals and congestion and delays, but it made access less dependent on wealth, less of a barrier for people who had been effectively excluded by the lack of affordable transportation options. Other infrastructure followed. Terminal 4 was rebuilt, modernized, expanded. Terminal 5 replaced the old TWA Flight Center's operational spaces while preserving Saarinen's landmark structure. Terminals 1 and 8 were demolished and replaced. The investments were massive, billions of dollars spread over decades, a recognition that the airport couldn't survive on mid-century infrastructure, that modernization was essential even if it meant erasing much of what had made the airport distinctive. But the modernization also felt generic, the new terminals indistinguishable from new terminals anywhere else, filled with the same retail chains and restaurants, designed for efficiency rather than identity. The airport was better in many practical ways. It was also less interesting, less specific to New York, less reflective of any particular vision, beyond the baseline requirement of moving passengers through as quickly as possible. Some mourned the loss. Others thought it was overdue. The question was whether airports needed to be distinctive or just functional, whether character mattered, or whether it was a luxury that interfered with operations. Another explanation suggests that the infrastructure investments weren't about saving JFK, but about protecting the Port Authority's revenue stream, that the airport was too valuable as a source of fees and rents and economic activity to let it decline further, that the improvements were driven by financial logic rather than any commitment to passengers or workers or the city. That may be true. But it's also possible for infrastructure to serve multiple purposes simultaneously, to be motivated by money and still improve people's lives, to be transactional and still necessary. The air train works. The new terminals function better than the old ones. Whether the motives behind those improvements were noble or cynical doesn't change the fact that they made a difference. The question that never settles. There's a belief that airports reveal who we are, that the way we design them, fund them, move through them, says something about our priorities and fears and aspirations. JFK has always been caught between competing visions of what an airport should be: a monument to American ambition, a practical utility for moving people efficiently, a gateway that welcomes or filters, a workplace or a corporate profit center, a public space or a secured zone. The airport has been all of these things at different times, sometimes simultaneously, the meaning shifting depending on who you are and why you're there. For some passengers, JFK remains a symbol of arrival, the first glimpse of New York, the place where the idea of America becomes tangible. Walking through the terminal, hearing a dozen languages, seeing faces from everywhere, reinforces the mythology of the country as a crossroads, a place built by people coming from elsewhere. The airport makes that visible in ways few other spaces do, condensing the abstraction of immigration and global connection into the concrete experience of standing in line at customs or waiting for baggage. For others, the airport is a space of exclusion, where citizenship and documentation determine who moves freely and who gets pulled aside for questioning, where the promise of welcome is always conditional, always subject to scrutiny. The same terminal that represents opportunity for some represents vulnerability for others, a place where the power to allow or deny entry is exercised constantly, quietly, in ways that are difficult to contest. For workers, the airport is neither symbol nor gateway, but simply a job, often a difficult one, characterized by long hours and low wages and the physical toll of repetitive tasks. The airport's meaning for them is immediate and practical, tied to paychecks and shift schedules, and the struggle to make ends meet in one of the most expensive cities in the world. The romantic narratives about arrival and connection don't capture that reality. Don't account for the fact that the airport runs because people show up every day to do work that's essential and undervalued. The question of what JFK is remains unresolved because the airport contains all of these experiences simultaneously, because there's no single story that accounts for everyone who passes through it. Some see progress, others see decline, some see openness, others see surveillance. All of them are describing the same place, but the place they're describing depends entirely on where they're standing and what they're looking for. Another explanation suggests that airports don't reveal anything, that they're just buildings designed for a specific function, that the meaning we attach to them is projection, a way of making sense of our own experiences by attributing significance to spaces that are fundamentally neutral. Maybe the terminals are just terminals. Maybe the runways are just runways. Maybe the only question that matters is whether the airport works, whether it moves people from one place to another efficiently and safely, and everything else is decoration, narrative we add, because we can't tolerate the idea that some spaces are purely functional, stripped of deeper meaning. But if that's true, why does the airport feel like it means something? Why do people remember their arrivals so vividly? Why does the demolition of a terminal feel like loss? Maybe because spaces shape us even when we're not paying attention, because moving through an airport changes how we think about distance and belonging and home, because the experience of arrival or departure stays with us in ways that simple functionality can't explain. Or maybe not. Maybe it's just a place we pass through, and the stories we tell about it say more about us than about the airport itself. What remains in the spaces between? If you stand in certain parts of JFK late at night, after the last banks of departures have pushed back from the gates, you can feel the airport exhale. The terminals quiet. The announcements stop. The crowds thin to a few clusters of passengers on red-eyes, or those stranded by delays. Cleaners move through empty gate areas. Security guards walk long corridors. The building settles into a rhythm that feels less like an airport and more like any large structure when the people leave, full of echoes and mechanical hums, and the particular silence of spaces designed for noise. It's in these moments that the airport feels most like itself, stripped of the performance of travel, the rush and stress and constant movement. What remains is infrastructure, the physical reality of runways and terminals, and the systems that keep planes moving. There's something honest about the late-night airport, the way it reveals the gap between what the place is supposed to be and what it actually is when no one's watching, when the mythology falls away, and what's left is concrete and steel and the wear of millions of people passing through. Some believe these quiet moments are when the airport is most beautiful, when you can see the architecture without distraction, when the scale becomes apparent, when the ambition of building something this large feels both impressive and absurd. Others find it unsettling. The emptiness, the sense that the space is designed for crowds and feels wrong without them, incomplete. Both responses acknowledge that airports are strange places, designed for transients, for people who are always leaving, never quite inhabited, even when full. The question of what JFK became, whether it fulfilled the vision that created it, whether it succeeded or failed, remains open. The airport is still there, still operating, still moving. Millions of passengers every year. It's been rebuilt, renovated, reimagined multiple times. Parts of the original vision survive. Other parts have been erased. What exists now is a palimpsest, layers of different eras and different ideas about what an airport should be, all of them visible if you know where to look. The woman in the mink coat from the opening, standing in the terminal in 1963, waiting for a departures board that wouldn't update, believed she was in a place that represented the future. Whether she was right depends on which future you're measuring against, whether you're comparing the airport to what came before or what came after, whether you're judging it by its architecture or its operations or its role in the city or something harder to quantify. Another explanation suggests that the airport was never meant to be understood as success or failure, that it was always meant to be provisional, responsive to whoever was using it and for what purpose, that the only constant was change. If that's true, then asking whether JFK became what it was supposed to be is the wrong question. The right question is whether it adapted, whether it survived, whether it remained relevant, even as everything around it changed. The answer to that is complicated, conditional, never quite final. The airport still operates. Planes still land and take off. People still arrive believing this is the front door to America, or dreading that it is, or thinking nothing at all about the symbolism and just trying to get through customs and find their bags and get home. The building doesn't care. The runways don't care. The infrastructure persists regardless of what anyone believes about it. And maybe that's the only truth that matters, that the airport exists, that it works or doesn't work, that it will be here after the current version of the story has been replaced by another. The light is still gray. The carpet is still worn. Somewhere in the terminal, someone is waiting.